So now we're on the top of Kuf Tes Amud Beis, and we're learning the brisa that is answering the question: how much water would be sufficient such that his whole body would enter into this water, be covered by the water at one time? So when the Torah says Kol Besaro, it means that the entire body at one time is covered or immersed in the mikveh water. So how do we arrive at a conclusion about the shear of mine? So we're on the top now of Kuf Tesam Beis. The Gemara says, Amal Ama Barum Sholosh Amos. So if you're calculating the volume of water, it's going to be what we call 3 cubic amos. Why cubic amos? We're talking about an amma by an amma, and it's the height of 3 amos. Barum means the gova, so it's got to be machzik 40 sa. We'll see how we get from 40 sa to 40 sa from amal amma barum amma. And shiru chachamim shir mei mikvar boim sa. Now, what we start with is the question: what is the average size of a human body? And first we'll talk about the width. And we said the width is an amma. Then we talk about the height. Now, when we talk about the height, we speak about 3 amos. Now, most people are taller than 3 amos, but we're talking about the main part of the body, up until the chin. And that's considered 3 amos. So we have the height of 3 amos. We know now that as far as the rochav is concerned of this mikvah, we need 1 amma in rochav, and 1 amma is enough if he leaves his arms down, and he can fit in widthwise of 1 amma. And as far as the height is concerned, 3 amos. Okay. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than this, because when you talk about the width, you have to talk also about the width in the other direction, meaning how far is it from his back to his belly? That also has to be covered in the water, obviously. So the average body, I guess, is also about an amma, maybe less. Okay. So what we're talking about is the following: that if your average person would immerse himself into some sort of a receptacle or a cubicle that would be 1 amma in width and 3 ammas in height, if it was filled with water, he would actually be covered from let's call it head to toe. And that's exactly the shear of a mikveh. Now the question is, how do we arrive at 40 sa? In other words, we're coming to the conclusion that 3 cubic amos will hold 40 sa of water. So therefore, if you had some sort of a receptacle that is in terms of etzbos, and we'll see exactly how to break it down into etzbos, but you'll need an area that is 2 by 2 by 2.7 etzbos, and that's going to contain a revius of any liquid. And we're going to calculate it in the following way. The amma is 6 tefachim. A tefach is 4 etzbos. Therefore, an amma is 6 times 4 is 24 etzbos. Now, a sa'a is 6 kabim. 6 kabim make a sa. And therefore, a sa is the equivalent of 96 revios, which means 6 times 4 times 4. And therefore, if you have, getting back to our receptacle, you have an amma barochav, an amma ba'orech, and 3 ammas begova, which is equal to 40 sa. You can rewrite it as 24 times 24 times 72 etzbos, which is the equivalent of 3,840 reveals. 24 by 24 by 72 is 41,472. You can make the calculation. So if we want to use let's say to make life easier for ourselves, we use an F for an etzba, for finger breadth. We use an R for revius. Then the calculation is going to be at 4,100 and 427 etzbos is equal to 3,840 reveals. One reveals is 41,427 etzbos divided by 3,840, or 10.8 etzbos, which is the equivalent of, as we started off with, 2 etzbos by 2 etzbos by 2.7 etzbos. And in my Gemara, we have a very beautiful chart here in which he shows you all the operative calculations here. We are going to convert to tfachim, and we're going to end up, with a width of 6 tfachim by 6 tfachim, with a height of 18 tfachim, and that's going to give me a volume of 40 sa. And then that's this entire calculation. Amar of Ashi. Amali Ravin Bar Chinina. Ravin Bar Chinina told me the following: Shulchan Shel Migdash. Okay, now let's give a little bit of an introduction. Right, in the Heichal, in the Migdash, there was a shulchan for the lechem aponim, and the Torah tells us exactly what the measurements of the shulchan were. And we'll mention the measurements based on the Pasuk in Shmos Chaf Hey v'asisu shulchan atzei shitim amasayim orko v'ama rochvo v'ama v'chetzi komasa. Now, it's clear from the pasuk that the width of the shulchan is an amma, and that means the two ends of the shulchan, right? The two ends of the shulchan are the width of the shulchan. We're not talking about the length. The length, the Torah says, is 2 amos, but the width on the two ends is 1 amma. Now we have a problem, because we're going to derive from a pasuk that the shulchan is makabel tumah, and the Torah calls it shulchan atar, implying that it could be tumah. Now, if it's tumah, you have to put it into a mikvah. But the problem is, we said that the mikvah of Arba'im Psah has a width of 1 amma. There's no way that you can take a shulchan that has a width of 1 amma and put it into a mikvah of water that's only 1 amma in width. And therefore, Ravin Bar Chinina, to solve this problem, says that shel prakim hava, that the shulchan was made of segments that were put together, and you're able lefarek, you can take apart the shulchan in order to put it into the mikvah. So imagine this 1 amma of width, and we split it in half to be mefarek the shulchan, and now we're left with a half amma and another half amma. Again, we may have to loosen up the legs, but we're going to be able to submerge it in the mikvah. If you're going to tell that the entire shulchan, all of it together, was mehudak, was mechubar, and it's impossible to take it apart, if that be the case, then since the shulchan was 2 amos long and 1 amma wide, as the Torah indicates, then if the shulchan wood could be contaminated, we wouldn't be able to be matbil it in a mikvah, because you can't put it in its width if it's 1 amma wide. How could you put 1 amma into a 1 amma? You know, it's if the whole halal of the mikvah is exactly an amma from side to side, and that's the width, then you need some extra space in the mikvah in order to put the kli inside of it, if the kli is 1 amma berocha. So therefore, says Ravin, we have to come to the conclusion that the shulchan itself was made of parts, and we can take it apart if need be, and it's necessary to do so in order to put it into the mikvah. The Gemara rejects this because Shlomo HaMelech built a yam. It's called a yam because he built a mikvah in the Azor that was very, very large. My kusha, Dilma, perhaps, if you want to know how we can be tovel a shulchan in a mikvah, the answer is b'yam shasa Shlomo. Shlomo built a yam in the Beis HaMikdash for purposes of Tara. It's a gigis gedola, a very large receptacle, like a swimming pool. Eser amos al eser amos. It was 10 amos by 10 amos. Berum chamesh amos, that had the height of 5 amos. Ve'amida al shnemasar demuyos bakar minachoshes. Different images of animals, and it was made of copper, and it was held up. And clearly, it's wide enough to accommodate the shulchan. And Tani Rabbi Chia, Yam Sha'asa Shlomo Machzik 150 mikvah tara. The volume of the Yam, this mikvah that was built by Shlomo Melech, was such that it could hold 150 mikvahs. So there's no problem in putting a shulchan inside of it. Now, how do we get this number, 150 mikvahs, that could fit into the mikvah that Shlomo built? Okay, this gigantic pool, Solomon's pool, right? Okay. He has a long discussion here about how to calculate 150 mikvahs in this 10 amos by 10 amos mikvah called Yam Shel Shlomo. So we'll just read it through. He says, "Hacheshbenu kach godol hayam haya 10 amos al 10 amos berum 5 amos, shlosha amos hatachtonos." So the 3 amos at the bottom of this were merubos. They were square, 10 by 10 amos. Shtei amos elyonos, right? There were 5 amos begova. So the 2 higher amos, hayu agulos, they were round. Im kain b'shalosh amos hatachtonos berochav 10 amos al 10 amos shenechlak li 10 ritzuos. We're going to take that 10 square amos on the bottom, which is the bottom 3 amos of the height, is nechalik otzam kol ritzuli 10 chalok. We're going to divide up into 10 parts, 10 segments. Nekabel 100 chalokim shel amal amma begova shalosh amos. So you'll end up with 100 parts that are on an amma and an amma begova shalosh amos, which is the shear of a mikvah. The Arboim saw array 100 midos mikvah. In other words, the midah of a mikvah was 1 amma on 1 amma berum shalosh amos, with a height of 3 amos. Shtei amos elyonos shel hayam shenechlak li amos. Now, if they would have been squares, you have to take a circle and make it into a square. Is yoser ala igul, and that's because the chronos of the ribua make it even larger than an eagle, than a round Hu Reva. In other words, each eagle is Berochav Amal Amal, and it has a heke for circumference of Sholosh Amos. Beribua Yesh Beke for Arba Amos. Shenorid Reva Mimea, Shehu Esrim V'Chamesh. So we'll take a quarter off 100. We end up with removing 25. We're left with 75 chalokim of an amal begovach shtei amos. Shenaniach osam achas al shnia nekabel amal begova 150 amos. So he ends up with 150. Now we have no problem of being tovil the shulchan in the Yam Shel Shlomo. Now we go on to the Mishnah again. The Mishnah says, "Lo yivchasu lo me arba kosos." So the Gemara asks, "What do you mean 4 kosos?" 4 kosos means 2 sections of 2 each. So you drink 2 kosos, then you eat the meal, and then another 2 kosos. So your chiyuv of drinking 4 kosos is comprised of 2 different sets of kosos. Each set has 2 kosos. We have a sakana in what's called zugos, right? When you eat things in pairs, that's a sakana. How could it be that the Rabbana made a takana that would place us and expose us to danger? And the Olas Aaron asked the question, well, maybe he's going to drink something during the Su'uda, which would make it into an odd number. And he says that since we have to divvy out to the Oni, who doesn't have money for Dal Kosos, we give him for 4 Kosos. We're not giving him for a 5th Kos in the Suda to separate between the first 2 and the second 2. So the question here is about the takana. And it could be, this is the Pesach 9, that once the takana was established, then we apply the principle in Koheles of Shomer Mitzvah Lo Yeda Davar Ra. But how could they l'chatchila make a takana that puts us into a sakon? And a chashash of zugos applies whenever you have 2. And this has to do with kshafin. This has to do with forces of evil. And there's a Gemara later on in Daf Kuf Yud with regard to zugos that it's halach l'moshe misinai. That there are mazikim out there, there are demons and very powerful negative forces that are mazik, someone who's not careful about zugos. The Shalor writes that haminim, those who are apikorsim, toanim, they claim ein poel echad yochal lasos shtei peulos. So the minim deny that there's one God. Chas v'shalom, they say there's a plurality of gods. There are 2 gods, and therefore we have to avoid that number 2 because it sounds like, we're trying to satiate or worship Chas v'shalom 2 deities. He quotes Rabbeinu Bachai here in the footnote, Shekol Dover Sheni Hu Dover Ra. That this number 2 represents pirud, change and separation. It represents chilukei deos, debate, so to speak, and tension. And the mazikim come, and they are activated and empowered whenever there is chiluk and pirud, chilukei deos. In fact, Gehenom and mazikim, says Rabbeinu Bachai, were created on Yom Sheni, on the 2nd day. And therefore, Omru Chazal yesh lizor shelo lechol zugos. The Maharsha writes that zugos hemikoch hashnios, b'chol sheni ura, and you won't find the words ki tov on the 2nd day of creation, but Gehenna was created on the 2nd day of creation. So zugos always get their power, so to speak, from the sheni, from the number 2. And on Yom Revi it says, Ma'oros believe vav. Why believe Vav? Why was the Vav left out in the word Moros? It's written Chaser. That's Pasuk Yudalit in the first chapter of Genesis. Shenikan Rishutz Lamazikim Lahazik. So that's as far as 4. 4 is 2 plus 2. Now we had another 2. We get to Yom Shishi, and that was the day in which man ate from the Eitz Hadas and received the Klol. So ha'osa o ochel shtayim hamazikim yicholim lishlok. But whenever he eats or creates 2, the mazikim have a power to control it. He quotes Reb Tzadok Hakomi Lublin in a book called Or Zerul at Tzaddik that kol inyan zugos v'harkava heim b'yisod hara. That whenever you have a harkava, meaning you add 1 and 1 and you create something that's a 2-part entity, then it's yisodo ra. Umalimim es yichud Hashem ba'olam. And that sort of covers the oneness, the unity of one God. And once that's concealed, then the Ra has a koach, it's empowered to be sholeh, because he's doing it bezugos. I just want to mention here that the Rambam, in his works, I mean, in every single work that he wrote, he says that forms of sorcery are just sheer nonsense. No rational person should give any credence. This is the Rambam in his Pirush HaMishnayis Avodah Zarah, and in his Mishnah Torah and Hilchas Avodah Zarah Perkid Aleph, in his Mor Nevuchim Chelik Gimel. Twice in Mor Nevuchim he says that any accounts of these forces associated with planets, constellations, etc., these are all fabrications that are built upon fabrications. They are invented to control the masses, to extract from them money and allegiance, preying on the populace's most dire fears. So according to the Rambam, belief in astrology, that's the first step down a slippy slope to paganism. And the Torah therefore forbids all forms of sorcery. And why? Because they are deception. It's all just deception. They're empty acts. And they could lead to idolatry. And the Ramban simply attacks the Rambam and many others, that the Rambam was influenced by different philosophical schools, etc. There really is a power of sources. There are other worldly forces that are used and can be activated if one wants to accomplish certain terrible things. The Ramchal has in Derech Hashem a presentation. I'll read to you an English translation of the Ramchal. He writes, when God created the universe, he created a hierarchy that included angelic entities and constellations that would transmit his will step by step to the world below. But he also made it possible for a man to utter or combine certain names, divine names, that would in one way or another affect this chain. And if man gives, since he's given free will, he has at every level a choice between good and evil. So God created a system of forces that are impure, parallel to his pure hierarchy of forces, that would similarly accomplish supernatural effects in the lower world. This method is called sorcery. And we cannot deny all the reliable publicity or publicly recognized accounts of genuine sorcery. Chazal clearly held that sorcery was a reality, and all over the Talmud there are references to sorcery, and the plain meaning of these statements in the Talmud is that sorcery is effective. There's a lot more here about this issue, which is an issue up, unto this day. In any event, the Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin, Samach Hey, Samach Vav, Samach Zayin, delineates various forms of sorcery, kshofim, and kshofim machishim, pamal yishal mala. Then there's something called shadim. Then there's something called mazikin. Each one has its own, so to speak, power or category of powers. Anyway, Zugos is considered by the Gemara to be very dangerous. And the Gemara proves this from a brisa, lo yochal adam trei. A person shouldn't eat two at a time, meaning two eggs or two nuts, walnuts. Lo yishta trei, shouldn't have 2 cups of whatever he's drinking. Lo yikaneach atzmo v'beis hakisei trei pa'amim. Lo yaset tzrachav, he's talking about act of intimacy, trei pa'amim, twice. All this depends on whether he does it l'shem shamayim. I mean, the Gemara says in Masechet Eruvin that if a person wants to have banim scharim, he should be boel v'yashana v'boel. So, but here we're not talking about l'shem shamayim, and therefore the number 2, the repetition of something twice, or in our case in Shtiyas Daled Kos, he's drinking 2 cups of wine, that is dangerous. Rav Nachman says that on this night of Pesach, Rav is going to have another answer to this question. But Omar Kra, the Torah says in Parshas Bo, Leil Shimurim Hu Lashem, Shimurim L'chol B'nei Yisrael L'dorosam. And what does that mean, Leil Shimurim? Leil HaMeshumar Uba Min HaMazikin. It's a night in which we're protected from the negative forces of mazikim. So we're going to have to worry about the fact that we're drinking 2 cups at a time. Rav Amar, Kos Shel Bracha Mitztarif L'Tova. The 3rd kos of the 4 kosos is the kos of Birkas HaMazon. And that kos is connected to the 2 kosos before it and to the kos afterwards. It's like the bridge that connects the first 2 with the 4th. And that kos is called a kos shel bracha. Kos shel birkas hamazon is a kos shel bracha. And that removes any sort of klol, any sort of curse from negative forces. Now, the Mefarshim want to know, why does he mention dafka kos shel birkas hamazon and not kos shel kiddush? That's also a kos shel bracha. But birkas hamazon is the oraisa. Kiddush on a yontiv at least is only derabbanan. But the simple pshat in the Gemara is the reason why the Gemara is mentioning Kiddush and rather Birkas HaMazon, because we're trying to focus in on the 3rd kos, which connects the first 2 with the 4th. It's that bridge. So therefore, when he drinks the 4th kos after the kos shel birkas hamazon, then it's not a tziruf of kos shlishi with kos revi to set up zugos, but rather it's considered that he drank 3 kosos plus a kos shel bracha, which is the kos of birkas hamazon, and 3 is an odd number, so that's not a problem. And later on Daf Kuf Yud, we have something similar with regard to the Yishmereka, that it's not mitztarif l'ra. Okay, that's a Gemara that we'll get to later. Ravina Omar, he has another answer to this question. Arba kosei tikinu rabbanon derech cherus. We have to drink 4 cups of wine and demonstrate our freedom. So that's one aspect of the Dalit Kosos. And if you remember, we discussed yesterday that even if we would drink consecutively, bevas achas, 4 cups of wine, he has been Makaimi, fulfilled his mitzvah of derech cherus. But Yedayayin lo yotze is another element and dimension to the mitzvah Dalit Kosos, that each kos is a separate entity on which a bracha is recited. Ol chad v'chad, each one of these kosos, here on Daf Kuf Yud and Aleph, mitzvah bi'ape nafshehu, it's a separate mitzvah, and therefore there's no tziruf to make it into 4 cups. So yesh lachar, are we drinking 4 cups as one entity, or 1, 1, 1, and 1 that happens to add up to 4? Each kos is a mitzvah unto itself by virtue of the bracha that he recites on that kos. So, for example, the first kos he recites Kiddush, second Magid, Gal Yisrael, third Birkas Hamazon, and 4th is Hallel. Each kos is a separate entity. We don't apply zugos when Each one is a kiyum and a mitzvah unto itself, independent of the other. In fact, my Rebbe once indicated that the idea of reciting a bracha is critical because it's not just a mitzvah of shtia derech cheres, it's shtia of a kosher bracha. Each kos has its own bracha, and the bracha engenders a personality and identity to that kos. Now the mitzvah is to drink that kos, but the kos itself is a kosher bracha. Once a kosher bracha, we have 4 brachos, each kos is a separate entity, hence there's no issue whatsoever of zugos. Okay, then, and tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem, we'll pick it up here on the top of daf